In the blink of an eye, her world collapsed. Betrayed by the man she loved, humiliated by the very family she trusted, and abandoned at her lowest. They thought she was powerless, but what they didn't know was that she held a secret that would change everything. As the truth unfolds, power shifts, and those who once mocked her begin to face consequences they never saw coming. This is a story of betrayal, hidden strength, and a comeback no one expected. This story reminds us never underestimate someone in their weakest moment. Strength is often silent, and true power reveals itself when it matters most. Value yourself, trust your instincts, and remember, what's meant for you will never be taken away by others. If this story irritates you, don't forget to support the channel with one like and one share so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories. Thanks for watching.
42 million people witnessed a billionaire wrap his hands around the throat of his pregnant wife. It happened at a crowded charity gala with hundreds of guests looking on. She was 8 months pregnant. Security cameras captured every single second of it. But what happened next is what truly shocked the world. She did not run. She did not hide. She simply picked up her phone, downloaded a recording application, and called him back. The action she took next would bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees. This is the story of a woman who was told, "I own you." She decided right then that those would be the last words her husband would ever speak to her without facing the consequences. This story holds a powerful lesson. The cage door was never locked. She had been her own jailer all along. The very moment she stopped waiting for permission to save herself was the moment she became free. If you or anyone you know feels trapped in silence, please remember that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It is the bravest thing a person can ever do. This is more than a story about abuse. It is about taking back your name, your voice, and your own power. It is proof that no amount of money can keep the truth buried forever. And it shows that the courage of one person can shatter a painful cycle that has lasted for generations. If this story touches your heart, please leave a comment and tell someone who needs to hear this message. Hit the like button so this story can reach more people. Share it because you never know who might be listening in silence, just waiting for a sign that they are not alone in their struggle. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe and join us. Great stories can change lives. Let us change them together. The only sound in the silent room was the steady beep of a hospital monitor. Tori's eyes slowly fluttered open. Her vision was fuzzy around the edges. Nothing felt right. The lights were painfully bright, and the air had a metallic taste. Her throat burned with a pain that felt like she had swallowed broken glass. "My baby," she whispered, the words coming out before she even knew where she was. "Is my baby okay?" A face appeared above her. It was a woman with kind eyes and glasses with wire rims. Dr. Sarah Hoffman. Tori recognized her obstetrician through the confusing fog in her mind. "Your daughter is stable, Tori." Dr. Hoffman gently placed a cold ultrasound wand on Tori's swollen stomach. The screen next to the bed blinked on, revealing the outline of a tiny body curled up inside her. "You, on the other hand, have suffered some very serious trauma." Tori slowly lifted her hand to her neck. She touched the skin and flinched in pain. The bruises felt swollen and incredibly sore beneath her fingertips. She traced their shape over and over again. She could not stop touching her throat, as if she was trying to confirm that the nightmare was real, that it had really happened, that her own husband had actually put his hands around her neck and squeezed until her world faded to black. The baby suddenly kicked. It was a strong, firm push against her ribs. Tori let out a slow breath. Her daughter was alive. They were both still alive. "Mrs. Ashford, there are 2 detectives outside who need to talk to you," Dr. Hoffman said in a voice that was both gentle and firm. "Do you feel strong enough to answer a few of their questions?" Tori nodded her head. The small movement sent a sharp pain through her neck and down her back. 2 people walked into the room. One was a woman in her 50s with short, gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. The other was a younger man who looked tired. He already had his notebook open. The woman pulled a chair up next to the hospital bed while the man placed a recording device on the small table nearby. "Mrs. Ashford, my name is Detective Martinez. This is Detective Brooks. We need to ask you some questions about what took place at the Children's Cancer Gala last night." The older detective's voice was professional, but it had a hint of kindness. Can you please tell us what you can remember? Last night, the gala. Tori's mind struggled to connect the broken pieces of her memory. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the sound of music. And Derek's face twisted into a mask of rage, his hands on her throat. I do not, she started, then stopped, swallowing carefully to avoid the pain. It all happened so fast. Take all the time you need, Detective Martinez said softly. Tori closed her eyes. Everyone saw it. The thought crashed into her like a giant wave. She had been choked in front of hundreds of people. The ballroom was full of cameras and witnesses. There was no way to deny what happened. There was no way to explain it away. She could not say she fell down the stairs or walked into a door, or that it was all just a big misunderstanding. 17 witnesses have already come forward with their statements, Detective Brooks said in a quiet voice. The security footage from the venue captured the entire incident. Tori opened her eyes. Tears began to stream down her face without her permission. Suddenly, the door to her room burst open. A man in his early 60s came rushing in. His salt and pepper hair was a mess and his shirt was untucked. James Caldwell froze in place when he saw his daughter lying in the hospital bed. His face turned from white to red, and then to an expression that was completely blank. That final expression was the one that truly scared Tori. She'd never seen it on her father's face before. It was not anger. It was something colder than anger. It was something that felt final. Baby girl? The words came out sounding broken. Tori had not heard him call her that in so many years, not since before she had married Derek, not since she had become Mrs. Ashford and left her old self behind. Daddy, she said, her voice cracking, in front of everyone. I cannot, James walked to her bed and took her hand, being careful to avoid the intravenous line. His grip felt warm and strong. It felt real. She held onto it as if it were a lifeline. I am going to fix this, he said. The way he said it did not sound like a promise. It sounded like a fact, like saying that the sun was going to rise in the morning. The two detectives looked at each other and quietly began to pack up their equipment. We will return later, Detective Martinez said. Get some rest, Mrs. Ashford. After they were gone, the room was silent except for the constant beeping of the monitor. James held his daughter's hand and just stared at the dark bruises on her throat. He clenched his jaw over and over, but he did not say a word. He did not have to. Tori could see everything she needed to see in his eyes. Another person appeared in the doorway. It was Rebecca Morrison, Tori's best friend from college. She was holding a tablet computer. Her mascara was smudged down her face, and her usually perfect hair was messy and hanging around her shoulders. Tori, Becca's voice shook. I am so sorry. I did not want to be the one to show you this, but it is everywhere. She walked slowly toward the bed and held out the tablet. It was posted 4 hours ago. On Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, everyone is sharing it. Tori took the tablet. Her hands were trembling. The video was already playing. It was security footage from the night before. The image was black and white, but it was perfectly clear. The camera showed a hallway just outside the main ballroom. Tori appeared first, with one hand resting on her pregnant belly, walking slowly in her fancy evening gown. Then, Derek appeared behind her, his tuxedo perfectly fitted. His face was completely twisted with rage. Tori watched her own image turn to face him on the screen. She could not hear the sound, but she remembered every single word. His hands shot out toward her throat. His fingers wrapped around her neck, and then he squeezed. On the screen, her eyes grew wide, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her pregnant belly was easy to see, pressing against Derek as she struggled to push him away. He squeezed even harder. Her hands clawed at his wrists. Her knees started to buckle beneath her. Two waiters suddenly ran into the shot. They grabbed Derek's arms and pulled him away from her. He finally let go of her throat. His face showed no sign of regret, only pure fury. The video stopped. Underneath it, a number glowed in bright red letters. 42 million views. Tori dropped the tablet onto the bed. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. There is more, Becca said in a low voice. His lawyers released a statement about an hour ago. She picked up the tablet and swiped to a news article. Derek's attorney was standing on the steps of their mansion, surrounded by microphones. Mr. Ashford deeply regrets the altercation that occurred last evening, the lawyer read from a piece of paper. His wife has been experiencing severe emotional instability related to her pregnancy for several months. Mr. Ashford is committed to getting his family the help they need during this difficult time. Tori felt her father's hand tighten around hers. The video then cut to a new scene. It was Margaret Ashford, Derek's mother. She was wearing a cream-colored suit and expensive pearl earrings. Her face looked calm and sympathetic. She was the perfect picture of a concerned, dignified mother. Tori has been very difficult throughout this entire pregnancy, Margaret said, dabbing at her dry eyes with the tissue. We have all been so worried about her mental state. Derek has been under a tremendous amount of pressure trying to care for her. They were already twisting the story. They were already painting her as the villain, the unstable wife, the emotional pregnant woman, the heavy burden. Tori's phone, which was sitting on the bedside table, started to ring. The screen read, "Private number." She stared at it. It rang 4 times, then 5. James reached for it, but Tori was faster. She picked it up, pressed the answer button, and held it to her ear. "Come home, Victoria." It was Derek's voice. It was calm and controlled. It was the voice he used with investors and the board of directors. It was the voice that fooled everyone. "We will forget this ever happened. I will tell the public it was just a misunderstanding. We will move on from this." Tori's hand went back to her throat. She could feel the real, undeniable bruises. "No," she whispered. "I am sorry, I did not quite hear that." His tone became sharp. "What did you say?" "I said no." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she heard a short, cold laugh like the sound of ice cracking. "You do not get to say no to me, Victoria. I own you. I own that baby. You will come home, or I will make sure you lose absolutely everything." The line went dead. Tori slowly lowered the phone. She looked at her father and then at her best friend. They were both staring at her with the same look on their faces, a mixture of deep concern and barely controlled anger. "I'm not going back," Tori said. Her voice was stronger now and much clearer. Something inside of her had changed when Derek spoke those words. When he said, "I own you." Something had broken, but something else was now taking its place. "I am never going back there." James leaned over and gently kissed his daughter's forehead. "You will not have to," he said. "I promise you that." After Becca left to get them some coffee and James stepped out into the hallway to make some calls, Tori was finally alone for the first time since she had woken up. She reached for her phone, staring at the screen for a long moment. Then, she opened the App Store and looked for an app to record phone calls. She downloaded one, tested it, and made sure it was working perfectly. She did not tell a single soul. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for her father or her lawyer to suggest it. She just did it herself, quietly and carefully. She knew Derek would call her again. He always did. He always had to have the last word, to remind her that he was the one in control. But this time, she would be ready. This time, his own words would be the very thing that brought him down. Tori put the phone down on her bedside table. She laid both hands on her stomach and felt her baby daughter kick. "We are going to be all right," she whispered to her. "I do not know how yet, but we are going to be all right." The heart monitor next to her beeped steadily. The rain that had been threatening all day finally started to fall, tapping softly on the hospital window. And in another part of the city, in a penthouse apartment that cost more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes, Derek Ashford was pouring a glass of whiskey. He was also calling his lawyers, feeling sure his wife would come crawling back to him. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. This was 6 hours before the ambulance arrived. 6 hours before the world saw the security footage. 6 hours before 42 million people watched her husband try to end her life. Tori was standing in her giant walk-in closet trying to figure out what to wear. The Children's Cancer Gala was one of the most important charity events of the entire year. She had planned to go for months. That was back when she still cared about things like that. That was back when she still felt like herself. "Are you ready yet?" Derek's voice called out from the bedroom. "We are going to be late." Tori selected a dark blue maternity dress. It had long sleeves and a high neckline. It was a safe, appropriate, and comfortable choice for a woman who was 8 months pregnant. Her back was always aching, her ankles were always swollen, and she had not slept well in weeks. Derek suddenly appeared in the closet doorway. He was already wearing his tuxedo. It had been perfectly fitted by a tailor who charged more for one suit than most families pay for a year of rent. He looked down at the dress in her hands and his jaw grew tight. "That dress makes you look huge," he said. "Change." "I am 8 months pregnant, Derek. I am huge." His eyes became narrow, and the feeling in the room turned cold. "Do not be difficult. Just pick something else." Tori hung the blue dress back on the rack. Her hands were already starting to tremble. She knew this mood all too well. She saw the tightness around his eyes and heard the sharp tone in his voice. She noticed the way his jaw was clenched. These were all warning signs she had learned to recognize over 3 years of being married to him. It was a language of danger that only she understood. She then pulled out a black dress, but it was too formal. A red one was too bright. A gray one was too boring. "For goodness sake, Victoria," Derek said, stepping into the closet. His cologne was sharp, expensive, and completely overpowering. "It is not that hard. Just pick a dress." Tori flinched when she heard his tone. She reached for a gown the color of champagne and held it up for him to see. It was elegant and simple. It was the kind of dress that would look good in pictures without getting too much attention. Derek stared at it for a long second, then gave a single nod. "That is better. Now hurry up." And with that, he left the closet. With shaking hands, Tori changed into the champagne-colored dress. It took her 3 attempts to get the zipper up over her pregnant belly. When she finally looked at her reflection in the mirror, she barely knew the woman looking back. She saw hollow eyes and a forced smile. It was a total stranger wearing her face. She used to be somebody. She used to be Victoria Caldwell. She once ran a charity that helped poor children get a good education. She used to run marathons. In fact, she was training for her 4th marathon when she met Derek at a fundraiser. He was so charming that night, so magnetic. He was the kind of man who could make you feel like you were the only person on earth. She should have realized that his charm was just a trap. It always is. The ride to the gala was completely silent. Derek's driver moved through the evening traffic while Derek scrolled through his phone. Tori just watched the city lights become a blur through the tinted window. She put a hand on her stomach and felt her daughter kick. The kicks were strong, insistent, and full of life. "I am sorry," she thought to her baby. "I am so sorry that I chose him." The car pulled up to the hotel's main entrance. Dozens of photographers were lined up on the red carpet. The flashes from their cameras went off like a lightning storm. As soon as the car door opened, Derek put his hand on Tori's elbow to guide her out. To anyone watching, he looked like a protective and gentle husband. He seemed like a devoted man helping his pregnant wife. But only Tori could feel his fingers digging into her skin. He squeezed hard enough to leave bruises under the fabric of her dress. "Smile," he whispered through a fake smile of his own. "Look happy." So, Tori smiled. And the cameras absolutely loved it. Mrs. Derek Ashford, pregnant and glowing, the perfect wife for a billionaire. The next day, these pictures would be in all the magazines, on all the gossip websites, and all over social media. They would show the beautiful couple living a fairy tale life. But no one ever takes pictures of what happens when the doors are closed. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers lit up the room. Hundreds of guests were there. Women wore designer dresses that cost more than a new car. Men in custom tuxedos drank champagne that cost more for one glass than a normal family spends on groceries in a week. Every important person in the city was at this event. Then, Margaret Ashford, Derek's mother, appeared out of the crowd. She was wearing a white silk dress and was covered in diamonds. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her posture was stiff, and her smile was as fake as a politician's. She leaned in to kiss Tori's cheeks, but did not let her lips actually touch her skin. "Darling, you look—" Margaret paused, looking Tori over from head to toe. Her expression was judging every single flaw. Glowing. That word just hung in the air between them like a sharp knife. What Margaret really meant was something very different. She meant, "You are fat. You are an embarrassment. You are not good enough for my son. You are not good enough for this family." "Thank you, Margaret," Tori said in a quiet voice. She had learned a long time ago that saying anything else would just be used against her later. Derek's hand was still gripping her elbow. He steered her through the party, controlling where she went and who she talked to. He decided how long she could stay in any conversation. At this party, she was not a person. She was just an object, an accessory to be shown off and managed. But then Tori saw a familiar face across the room, and her own face lit up with a real smile for the first time all night. It was Marcus Webb, a journalist she had worked with years ago. This was back when she ran her own charity, back when she had her own career and her own life. It was back when she was still Victoria Caldwell. "Marcus!" she called out, waving before she could even think about it. He walked over to her with a warm smile. He was in his late 30s and had sharp eyes. He was the kind of reporter who saw everything and never forgot a detail. "Tori, it has been way too long. How have you been?" "I am good, really good," she said. She could feel Derek's grip tighten on her arm, but she decided to ignore it. For just 1 minute, she wanted to feel like herself again. "How is the world of journalism?" "It is busy. I am working on a big story about corporate greed right now. Some really interesting things are coming out." Marcus then looked at her belly. "So when are you due?" "In 6 weeks. It is a girl." "Congratulations." "Are you planning to go back to your charity work after she is born?" Tori's eyes lit up. This was the first time in months that someone had asked about her plans and her future. They were not asking about the baby or the marriage or Derek's latest business venture. Someone was asking what Victoria Caldwell wanted. "Maybe. I have been thinking about it. There is so much that needs to be done for youth education, and I really miss it." "My wife is tired," Derek said, appearing at her side like a dark shadow. His smile was tight and controlled. It was the smile he always used when he was angry but had to pretend he was not. "Pregnancy brain, you know how it is. She does not even know what she is saying." "Actually, I was just," Tori began to say. But Derek's hand moved from her elbow to her upper arm. His fingers dug into the muscle, pressing hard enough to leave bruises. He squeezed so hard that she let out a small gasp, but it was so quiet that only she and Derek could hear it. "Excuse us, Marcus. It was nice to see you." He then pulled Tori away from the conversation. She almost fell since her balance was off from her pregnant belly. Derek did not even slow down for her. "I need to use the restroom," Tori said once they were far away from Marcus. "Fine. Do not take all night." She walked through the crowd, heading for the hallway that led to the bathrooms. The loud noise of the party started to fade away. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor. The hallway was much quieter and cooler. The sounds of the gala were muffled by the thick walls. She pushed the restroom door open and quickly locked herself inside a stall. Her hands were shaking badly again. She took several deep breaths, trying to slow down her racing heart. The baby was kicking over and over, as if she could feel her mother's fear. "It will be all right," Tori whispered, tracing slow circles on her pregnant belly. "It'll be all right. We will be all right." But she did not believe the words she was saying, and had not for a very long time. After a moment, she left the restroom stall. She washed her hands and checked her face in the mirror. Her makeup was still flawless. Her hair was perfectly in place. The bruise that was starting to form on her upper arm was hidden by the champagne-colored fabric. From the outside, she looked perfect. She always did. Tori walked back into the hallway. Derek was waiting for her. Her stomach tightened into a knot. He leaned against the marble wall, his arms folded across his chest. His bow tie was a little loose. He had been drinking. She saw it in the slight gloss of his eyes, the red flush on his skin, and the unnaturally rigid way he held himself. "You made me look like a complete fool," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and full of menace. "Talking to that reporter about your plans to go back to work, as if you have a clue what you are talking about." "I was just making conversation, Derek." "He is an old family friend. I do not give a damn who he is." "You are not allowed to have opinions in public. You are not allowed to disagree with me. And you are certainly not allowed to talk about your pointless little charity project like it is important. I was not disagreeing with you, I just—" "Shut up." He took a step toward her, and his shadow covered her completely. He was 6'2" and outweighed her by 80 pounds, and she was 8 months pregnant, with swollen feet and a shifting center of gravity that made it difficult to even stand up straight. She had never felt so small in her life. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is," he continued, "to have a wife who cannot control her mouth? Who acts like she is still some nobody running a failed little nonprofit? Derek, people are right inside that door. They will hear you." His hand moved like a snake and clamped around her throat. Tori's back slammed against the cold marble wall. The force of the impact stole the breath right out of her lungs. Above them, the chandelier swayed, throwing wild shadows all around the hall. Derek's fingers dug into her windpipe. There was no warning, no gradual pressure. He went from 0 to 100% force in an instant. She could not get any air. She clawed at his hands, trying to pull them away. Her fingernails dug into his wrists, while her feet slid on the polished floor, trying to find some leverage. The baby inside her began to kick wildly, each small movement a silent scream. Derek's face was just inches away from hers. His breath was a foul mix of whiskey and pure rage. His eyes were like two black holes. "You are nothing without me," he hissed, and squeezed even harder. Tori's vision began to go blurry. Gray spots started to bloom at the edges, multiplying and spreading inward. Her knees gave out, but Derek's powerful grip held her pinned upright against the wall like a butterfly in a display case. This was it. She was dying. She was dying in a marble hallway during a charity fundraiser, 8 months pregnant, wearing a beautiful champagne dress that her husband had insisted she buy. And the very last thing she would ever see was his face. Suddenly she heard voices and running footsteps, the sound of dress shoes slapping against marble. "Hey, stop that! Somebody call 911!" Two waiters appeared, young men in crisp white shirts and black vests. They grabbed Derek's arms and pulled him backward with all their strength. His hands finally let go of Tori's neck. She collapsed to the floor, gasping and choking. The air rushing back into her lungs felt like it was on fire. Her hands flew to her belly, instantly checking, feeling, pressing. The baby kicked. Thank God the baby was still moving. The baby was still alive, still a fighter. A crowd of people rushed into the hallway. Someone was on the phone calling for an ambulance. Someone else was taking pictures with their phone. Derek was now being held back by 3 men, and they were all struggling to keep him under control. His face was bright red, and his eyes were completely wild. He was not sorry. He was not ashamed. He was absolutely furious that he had been stopped. Tori looked up through a film of tears. She saw Margaret Ashford standing on the edge of the growing crowd. It was Derek's mother. She had her phone out, held up at chest height. She was recording. She was not calling for help. She was not rushing to help her daughter-in-law. She was not trying to stop her own son. She was just recording the scene, filming Tori on the floor and filming Derek as he was being restrained. Their eyes met for a single, terrible moment. Margaret's expression was completely blank. Empty. It was the face of a woman who had witnessed violence before and had learned to simply do nothing but watch. Margaret slowly lowered her phone and slipped it into her purse. Then, everything went black. Tori woke up in a hospital bed. Again. Morning light streamed through the window, painting the room in soft, golden stripes. A monitor beeped in a steady, calm rhythm. Her throat throbbed with a deep, bruised ache that pulsed with every single beat of her heart. Her baby was still moving, still alive. Someone was sitting in the chair next to her bed. It was her father. He was awake, just staring down at his own hands. He looked as though he had not slept a wink. His shirt was creased and his hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes. He looked 10 years older than he had just yesterday. "Dad?" Tori whispered. James looked up immediately, his eyes red and swollen. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was hit by a garbage truck," she said. She tried to smile, but even that small motion sent a jolt of pain through her. "How long have you been here?" "All night. I was not going to leave you here by yourself." Tori reached for the cup of water on the small table. James handed it to her, his own hand gently steadying her trembling fingers. She took a slow sip, the cool liquid a small relief for her throat. "The police want to take another statement," James said, "but I told them they would have to wait. You need to get some rest. Tori placed the cup back on the table. She had been drifting in and out of sleep all night. In the quiet, dark hours when she was awake, she had been preparing for this exact conversation. She had been rehearsing it in her mind, knowing it was finally time. Dad, I have to tell you something, okay? This was not the first time. James became completely still. His hands, which had been resting on his lap, tightened into fists. His breathing changed. His entire body seemed to become rigid, like a spring wound as tight as it could go. What are you talking about? Tori looked straight at him, her hands strangely steady now. She had carried the secret for 3 long years. Finally, letting it go brought a sense of calm she had not felt in ages. I need you to just listen. To all of it, right from the very beginning. James's voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. I am listening. It started about 6 months after we were married, Tori began. The words were slow at first, but then they started to flow faster, like water bursting through a crack in a dam. I asked him to come to the annual fundraiser for my nonprofit. It was our biggest event of the year, and I had been planning it for months. I was so proud. I asked Derek to come, but he said he was too busy with work. I told him it was really important to me. She took a breath as the monitor beeped. He threw his phone against the wall. It exploded into pieces. Glass went everywhere. Tori closed her eyes, remembering. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor. Then he looked straight at me and said, Now look what you made me do. What did you do? James asked. His voice was perfectly controlled, the voice of a man holding himself together with pure force of will. I cleaned up the glass. I apologized. I told myself that he was just under a lot of pressure from his job. I said it was just one bad day, and that everyone has them. When was the next time? Tori kept her eyes shut. It was easier to tell the stories without having to see the pain on her father's face. It was 3 months later. I wanted to come visit you for Christmas. Derek insisted that we had to spend it with his mother. I suggested that maybe we could split the holidays. We could do Christmas Eve with Margaret, and then Christmas Day with you. She paused again. He punched a hole in the wall right beside my head. If I had been 6 inches to the left, he would have hit me. The monitor beeped. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping softly on the window. In the second year, the things he threw started landing closer to me. It was a glass that shattered on the floor near my feet. It was a dinner plate that hit the kitchen counter right next to my hand. He never actually hit me with any of them, not directly. But they got closer and closer each time, and it was always the exact same phrase. Look what you made me do. Did you tell anyone? James asked. I told Becca about it one time. She told me I had to leave him. I got so defensive. I told her she did not understand. I said that every marriage has its problems, and that Derek was under so much stress trying to run his company. I said that I just needed to be more understanding. Tori opened her eyes and looked at her father. I did not speak to Becca for 3 months after we had that argument. Derek was thrilled when we stopped talking. He said Becca was a terrible influence. He said she was just jealous of our money and our lifestyle. He said she was trying to destroy our marriage. James suddenly stood up. He walked over to the window and stared out at the rain. His hands were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were white. His shoulders were trembling. What happened in the 3rd year? He asked, without turning to look at her. He twisted my wrist during an argument. He grabbed it and bent it backwards so far that I heard something pop. He swore it was an accident. He said he did not realize how tight his grip was. I had to wear a brace for 2 weeks. I told everyone that I slipped and fell on the stairs. I told Dr. Hoffman the exact same story. Tori put a hand on her belly. That was right around the time I found out I was pregnant. And you thought having a baby would fix things, James said, his voice soft with sorrow. I thought maybe it would help him calm down. I thought it would give him something else to focus on besides his job and me and everything that I was doing wrong. She let out a bitter little laugh. I was not stupid, Dad, but I knew I was being stupid. Does that make any sense at all? Yes, James said quietly. It makes perfect sense, Tori went on, and now the words poured out of her in a rush. I made up an excuse for every single thing, every object he threw, every hole he punched in the wall, every time his hands were too rough or his words were like knives. I had a reason for all of it. The stress from work, the pressure from his family, and it was always my fault. for not being good enough or thin enough or quiet enough. The pregnancy only made it worse. He hated that my body was changing. He hated that I was tired all the time. He hated that I could not drink at his business events or fit into the dresses he liked. He said I was letting myself go. He told me I was embarrassing him. Did he ever hit you before last night? Not with a closed fist. But he would grab me. He would push me. He would squeeze my arms so hard that it would leave dark bruises. I had to cover them with long sleeves and makeup. Tori's voice became a faint whisper. Last month he shoved me into the kitchen counter. I hit it so hard that I could not catch my breath for a minute. I told Dr. Hoffman that I tripped over the cat. We do not even own a cat. James finally turned away from the window. Tears were streaming down his face, but his expression was not one of sadness. It was something else. It was cold, hard, and completely determined. I should have seen it, he said. I should have known what was happening. I did not want you to know. Derek was very good at isolating me. Every time I tried to make plans with you, he would schedule something else to stop me. A business trip, a dinner party, a visit from his mother. There was always a reason why I could not see you. When was the last time we had lunch? Just the two of us. Tori had to think about it. The silence in the room stretched on, filled only by the sound of the rain and the beeping monitor. Before the wedding, 3 years ago. James slowly closed his eyes. 3 years. His daughter had been living in a terrible situation for 3 years, and he had no idea. He had been so focused on building his own business. He was so lost in his own world, he never saw any of the signs. The lunches she canceled, the long sleeves she wore in the middle of summer. He never noticed the way she would flinch when Derek touched her. A tiny movement that you would only see if you were really looking. And he had not been looking. I am going to fix this, sweet girl. I promise you, he whispered. But how? He's a billionaire, Dad. He has an army of lawyers and public relations people. He knows everyone. James sat back down on the edge of the bed and gently took his daughter's hand. And I have $800 million and 30 years of connections in this city. I know every single investor, every board member, every person who matters in Derek's world. His voice was calm and cold. It was the voice of a man who had built an empire from absolutely nothing, who had fought his way from a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood to the very top of the financial world. He was a man who understood power and exactly how to use it. I'm going to take everything away from him, James said. Every single piece. Within 2 hours of Tori's confession, James Caldwell's guest house had become a war room. Papers were spread across every single surface. 3 cell phones were charging on the kitchen counter. Mugs of coffee, which nobody remembered making, had grown cold. Diane Sullivan was the first to arrive. She had been James's chief investment officer for 15 years. She was the type of woman who could figure out compound interest in her head while she slept and could read a financial statement the way most people read a good book. She walked in carrying a leather portfolio, wearing the expression of someone who had already done 3 hours of research that morning. I pulled all of Derek Ashford's finances, Diane announced, placing her portfolio on the table and taking out a tablet. Everything that is public and some things that are not. How did you get the private information? James asked. A small smile appeared on Diane's face, one that looked sharp enough to cut glass. I have my sources, she said. Derek's net worth is about $2.3 billion. Most of that money is tied up in his technology company, Ashford Innovations. He also has a mix of real estate, stocks, and money in accounts overseas. She swiped through a few screens filled with data. But here's the interesting part. His company went public 3 years ago. That means he has to answer to shareholders and a board of directors. If his stock price drops in a big way, he will lose control of his own company. What would make the stock drop? Tori asked from the couch. She had insisted on being part of the planning even though her father wanted her to rest. A scandal, losing the trust of investors, or criminal charges. Any of those things would do it, Diane explained, looking at James. And there is something else. I have people inside Ashford Innovations. There is a man named Gregory Whitman. He has been Derek's business manager for 10 years. My sources tell me he has been looking for a way out for months. He knows everything, James. He knows where the money is going, where it is coming from, and which accounts are hidden. But he is terrified. Derek has people watching him. Set up a meeting, James said. Off the record. Somewhere he will feel safe. He is not going to come easily. Derek has people following his family. His oldest daughter was followed on her way to school just last week. Then we offer him a fortress, James declared. Protection for his family, a full security team, whatever he needs. Next to arrive was Marcus Webb. The journalist had been awake all night with dark circles under his eyes and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He sat right down at the table and got straight to the point. I have been working on a story about Derek for 6 months, Marcus said. I have found evidence of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and very questionable business deals. I had a lot of small pieces, but never enough to publish the story. Until now. He opened his laptop. I managed to track down 6 women who dated Derek before Tori. 4 of them refused to talk to me. 1 of them left the country. But there is one woman, Jennifer Torres. She signed a non-disclosure agreement 5 years ago. He broke her wrist and then paid her $500,000 to go away. She is now living under a new name in a small town 2 states away, say. Can you find her? Tori asked. I already know where she is, Marcus replied. Getting her to talk will be the hard part. She's very scared. She has built a whole new life for herself. She does not want to go back to being one of Derek Ashford's victims. Tell her that if she stays quiet, there will be more victims, Tori said softly. Tell her to watch the video. Tell her to look at my pregnant belly and remember his hands on my throat, and then ask her if she can live with saying nothing. Marcus looked into her eyes. I will, he promised. The final member of the team arrived that afternoon. Her name was Catherine Mills, a divorce attorney. She was 55 years old and known in legal circles as the executioner. She had a reputation for completely destroying abusive husbands in the courtroom, and she had the case history to back it up. She had won 12 straight custody battles in domestic violence cases with 0 losses. Catherine sat down, looked over all the evidence they had collected so far, and immediately explained the urgent deadline that would control everything they did next. Listen to me very carefully, she said to all of them. Tori is due to give birth in 4 weeks. We have to file for emergency custody before that baby is born. The moment the child arrives, Derek can file for immediate access to the baby. If he files his papers first, a judge could give him temporary custody while the case is being decided. We absolutely cannot let that happen. She turned to Tori. I pulled a few strings. We have Judge Patricia Brennan assigned to our case. She has a zero-tolerance policy for domestic violence. But Judge Brennan is also extremely fair. She will not rule for us just based on emotion. We need evidence that is completely solid. 4 weeks, Tori. That is all the time we have. For the first time since that horrible night at the Gala, something that almost felt like hope began to flicker inside Tori's chest. She had a team. She had a plan. She had people who were ready to fight for her, but she had learned that hope was a very dangerous thing. Hope makes you lower your guard. Hope makes you believe that things might actually turn out okay. Derek's counterattack began 48 hours later. It was strategic, professional, and absolutely brutal. First, Tori's medical records started showing up on gossip websites. They were not her real records, but fake notes that described her as emotionally unstable, with suicidal thoughts and paranoid delusions. A psychologist who had never even met Tori, never treated her, and had never been in the same room with her, went on a morning talk show to talk about his concerns that she was at risk for postpartum psychosis. Then Derek froze all of their shared bank accounts. Checking, savings, credit cards, investment accounts, everything. With a shaking hand, Tori opened her banking app and stared at her personal account balance. $300. That was all the money she had left in the entire world. The hashtag gold digger started trending all over the globe. Thousands of people who had never met her, never spoken to her, and had never spent a single second in her life were calling her a liar and a manipulator. They said she was a woman who trapped a good man by getting pregnant and was now trying to ruin his life. Someone sent a picture to her phone. It was a surveillance photo of Tori leaving Dr. Hoffman's office, taken from across the street with a powerful lens. Underneath it was a message. "We are watching you. Come home." And then came the worst blow of all. Derek's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter to Dr. Hoffman's medical office. They threatened to sue her for supposedly releasing confidential patient information. They demanded that she take back her initial medical assessment of Tori's injuries. They used careful legal language to suggest that maybe Tori had caused the injuries to herself. Diane called James that evening. Her voice was flat, completely drained of any hope. Gregory Whitman backed out. Derek's people got to him. Someone followed his daughter home from school again. His wife is threatening to leave him if he helps us. He is too afraid to talk. James hung up the phone. He stood in his study and just stared at the wall for a very long time. Then, he called Catherine. "They are going after everyone," he said. "Everyone who tries to help her becomes a target." "That is how abusers work," Catherine replied. "They isolate you. They threaten you. They make the price of fighting back higher than the price of giving up." In her room in the guest house, Tori lay in bed, just staring up at the ceiling. The small bit of hope that had appeared that morning was completely gone, blown out like a candle in a storm. She picked up her phone at 2 a.m. "Dad, can I sleep in the main house tonight? I do not want to be alone." "Of course. Come over right now." She walked the short path from the guest house to the main house. The night was cold and clear, with stars scattered across a black sky. She could hear the normal sounds of the city far away, like a dog barking and a car alarm. She heard the whisper of the wind in the trees. But Tori felt eyes on her, watching her, following her. She started to walk faster. The countdown clock now read 26 days. The days started to blur together in a fog of fear and exhaustion. Tori stopped leaving her father's property completely. There was no good reason to go outside, but there were plenty of reasons to stay in. News vans were camped outside the gate, sometimes 20 or 30 reporters, all shouting questions every time the gate opened. Photographers with giant lenses hid in the bushes, snapping pictures of her through the windows. Protesters marched with signs declaring Derek's innocence and calling her a gold digger. Someone even left a dead rat on the doorstep. It was a real rat, its body stiff and its eyes glazed over. A note tied to its tail simply said, "Gold digger." James discovered it before Tori did and threw it away immediately. He did not say a word, but she saw that his hands were trembling. Tori escaped to the nursery her father had prepared in the guest house. She painted the walls a gentle yellow and arranged the tiny clothes by size, color, and season. She folded and refolded the baby blankets until every edge lined up perfectly. She even built the crib by herself. At 8.5 months pregnant, she could hardly reach the screws, but building something felt like the only useful thing she could do. One afternoon, Becca found her sitting on the nursery floor surrounded by piles of baby socks. There were two nearly identical white pairs. One had a delicate pink trim, while the other had tiny pink polka dots. They were almost the same, but not quite, and Tori had been trying to sort them for 2 hours. "Tori, what are you doing?" Becca stood in the doorway holding bags of takeout food, her face etched with worry. "Organizing," Tori said, holding up the socks. "These have pink trim and these have pink polka dots. They cannot be mixed up." "Okay," Becca said slowly. "But you have been organizing those exact same socks for 2 hours. I need them to be right." Becca put the food down. She carefully lowered herself to the floor next to her friend, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the tiny clothes. She gently took the socks from Tori's hands and placed them to the side. "Talk to me," she said softly. "Really talk to me." Tori's hands instinctively moved toward another drawer to sort. Becca gently stopped her. "Tori? I'm fine. I just need everything to be organized before the baby arrives. I need to have control over something." Her voice cracked. "Because I cannot control anything else." And then, everything came spilling out. "The news is saying I am insane. Derek's lawyers are threatening to take my baby. His mother is on television every single day calling me a liar. Someone left a dead rat on Dad's doorstep yesterday with a note, and I—" She pressed her hands hard against her eyes. "I cannot stop organizing these stupid socks." She was crying now. These were not the quiet, controlled tears she had cried in the hospital. This was real, ugly crying that came from a place so deep inside it felt like she was drowning. Becca wrapped her arms around her in a hug. "You are not fine," she said. "And that is okay. You do not have to be fine right now. I am supposed to be strong for the baby, for my dad, for everyone helping me." "Being strong does not mean you never break down," Becca said, holding her tighter. "It means you break down and then you get back up. Let yourself fall apart for a minute. I have got you." Tori sobbed into her best friend's shoulder. All the fear, anger, and grief she had bottled up for weeks came pouring out. She cried for the marriage she thought she would have, for the man she believed Derek was, and for the woman she used to be before she became Mrs. Ashford. She cried for a future she had imagined, a future that would now never happen. When the tears finally stopped, she felt completely empty, hollowed out, but also strangely lighter. That night at 3 in the morning, Tori could not sleep. The baby was practicing gymnastics inside her belly. She slipped out of bed and walked into the nursery. The room was dark, lit only by the moonlight shining through the window. She sat in the rocking chair and looked at everything she had prepared. She saw the crib with its soft yellow blankets, the changing table filled with diapers, and the bookshelf lined with picture books. She had picked out each book one by one, picturing herself reading them aloud to her daughter on quiet evenings. She had done all of this thinking Derek would be there. She thought they would be a family, that he would hold their daughter and magically become the man she had always hoped he could be. "I am sorry," Tori whispered to her belly. "I am so sorry I chose him." The baby kicked, as if in response. Tori picked up a tiny onesie that was white with yellow ducks. She folded it carefully, then unfolded it, and then folded it again. Her hands needed something to do. "I used to run marathons before I met your father, did you know that? I ran 3 marathons in 2 years. I was training for a 4th one when I met Derek at a fundraiser. He was so charming and magnetic, everyone in the room wanted his attention. And he was talking to me." She folded, unfolded, and folded again. "He said marathons were a waste of time. He told me I should focus on more important things, things that mattered to us and our future. So I stopped running. I gave away my running shoes. I canceled my race registrations. I told myself it was a sacrifice I was making for love." She put down the onesie and picked up another pair of tiny, impossibly small socks. "I used to have friends, a lot of them. I had lunch dates and book clubs and girls' nights out every other Friday. Derek said my friends were a bad influence. He said they did not understand our lifestyle, that they were just jealous of what we had. One by one, I stopped seeing them until only Becca was left, and I almost lost her too. I used to have opinions about politics and charity work and what restaurant we should try for dinner. Derek said my opinions made me sound stupid, that I embarrassed him whenever I spoke up. So I stopped having opinions. I just agreed with whatever he said about everything." She realized she was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face in the moonlight. "I used to be someone, baby girl. I was Victoria Caldwell. I ran nonprofits, I helped people, I was smart and capable and strong. Then I became Mrs. Derek Ashford, and I forgot how to be Victoria." A memory came to the surface. It was the last conversation she ever had with her mother. They were sitting in a hospital room, much like the one Tori had woken up in after the gala. Her mother's hand was frail, almost transparent, the skin like paper stretched over bone. Cancer had taken almost everything, but it had not taken her eyes. Her eyes were still fierce. "Baby girl, promise me something." "Anything, Mom." "Never let anyone make you small. The world will try. Men will try. Even other women will try. They will want you to shrink yourself down to make them feel comfortable. Do not do it. Take up space. Use your voice. Be big and loud and unapologetically yourself." "I promise, Mom." But she had broken that promise. She had let Derek make her small. She had shrunk herself down until there was almost nothing left. Tori stood up from the rocking chair. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain. Her reflection stared back at her with tired eyes, with fading bruises on her throat, and a belly that seemed impossibly large. But she was still here. She was still standing. She was still breathing. "I broke my promise," she said to her mother's memory, "but I can fix it. I can be big again for both of us. The clock on the wall showed 22 days remaining. Somewhere in the back of her mind, an idea was taking shape. It was something no one had suggested, something no one would ever expect. It was something she would do completely on her own. Tori could not sleep. She lay in bed at 4 in the morning, scrolling through her phone while the baby shifted and kicked inside her. She was thinking about something Diane had mentioned offhandedly during their first meeting. Gregory Whitman had let it slip before he backed out that Derek had a mistress, a model. Company money was paying her rent for expensive gifts for a luxury apartment downtown. Tori opened Instagram. She looked up Derek's public account. It was polished and perfectly curated, filled with photos of him at charity events, at conferences, and in his gleaming office. Nothing was out of place. She searched his tagged photos and his list of followers. Nothing seemed obvious. Then, she remembered. Derek always had a second phone. He kept it locked in the safe in his home office. She had seen him checking it late at night when he thought she was sleeping. She had never asked about it because she knew better than to ask Derek questions he did not want to answer. Her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Tori stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. She answered. A woman's voice, older and shaking, spoke as if she was terrified of being overheard. Check his second account. The username has DA and some numbers. The line went dead before Tori could say anything. She stared at the phone for a long time. She did not know who had called, but the voice had sounded familiar in a way she could not quite place. It was not someone she knew well, but maybe someone she had heard on television or across a crowded room. She started searching. DA 2019, DA private, DA 8834. She went through account after account, but none of them were right. Then she found it. It was a private account with only 3 followers. One of them was a model named Amber Collins. Tori scrolled through Amber's public page. She was 26 years old and beautiful, in the way that professional models are, all sharp angles and practiced poses. She was living in a beautiful apartment in the heart of the city. Her social media was a parade of expensive gifts, designer handbags, and ski trips to Aspen. She posted photos from restaurants where one dinner cost more than Tori had in her entire bank account. And Derek was paying for all of it with money from the company. Tori kept her plan a secret from everyone. She did not tell her father or Catherine or Becca. Instead, she sent a private message to Amber. It said, "My name is Victoria Ashford. I am Derek's wife. I'm not mad at you, but I need to talk to you. This is about your safety." 2 long days went by. Tori checked her phone constantly, sure that Amber would either ignore her or, even worse, show the message to Derek. Then a notification popped up. It was a single word. Where? They decided to meet at a small cafe 15 miles outside the city. Tori wore dark sunglasses and a baseball cap. She felt silly, like a character from a cheap spy movie. But she also felt a surge of something she had not experienced in years. Control. She was finally doing something herself, not just waiting for someone else to rescue her. She was not depending on her father's fortune or Catherine's legal skills or Marcus's reporting. She was taking her own action. When Tori walked into the cafe, Amber was already waiting. In person, the woman was smaller and thinner than she appeared in her pictures. Her makeup was flawless, but her eyes were guarded and defensive. They were the eyes of someone who was always expecting a fight. "You are just a jealous wife trying to destroy his life," Amber said, before Tori could even take a seat. Tori did not respond. She simply sat down, took out her phone, and opened the video from the gala. She placed it on the table between them without a word of commentary or explanation. She just let the footage play. Amber watched as Derek's hands wrapped around Tori's pregnant throat. She saw Tori's desperate struggle for air and then saw her body go limp. She watched as waiters rushed in to pull him away, and she saw Tori collapse onto the marble floor. The video clip ended, but Amber did not move a muscle. "He did this to me," Tori said in a low voice. "And he will do it to you. It is just a matter of time." Tori leaned in. "Has he started checking your phone? Has he told you which of your friends are a bad influence? Has he criticized the clothes you wear? Has he ever said, 'Look what you made me do'?" A flicker of recognition, then fear, crossed Amber's face. The seeds of understanding had been planted. Without a word, she stood up and walked out of the cafe. Tori sat by herself for a very long time. She sipped her tea and felt the baby give a little kick. She wondered if she had just made a huge, terrible mistake. She had not. In 2 weeks, Derek would start secretly monitoring Amber's phone. He would begin to question where she was going and who she was talking to. He would criticize her friends and tell her that her modeling career was a joke. He would say she was nothing without him. That is when Amber would call Tori, and she would come with financial records that showed every single dollar Derek had spent on her using company bank accounts. She would have receipts for the apartment, credit card statements for the gifts, and wire transfers for the trips. She would bring all the evidence that Gregory had been too afraid to share. But that was still 2 weeks in the future. Right now, the clock was ticking down with 20 days left, and Tori had other problems to solve. While Tori was reaching out to Amber, James and Diane were working on Gregory. Diane scheduled a second meeting at a diner 60 miles out of the city, a place where no one would know them. Gregory showed up looking like a man who had not slept in a month. "They threatened my daughters, James," he said. "Someone followed my oldest child from school again. A black car just waited in the parking lot for 2 hours. My wife is completely terrified. She wants us to pack up and leave the state." "I will get security for your family," James promised. "A private team, 24/7, for as long as it takes. I will cover the entire cost." "You do not get it," Gregory said. "Derek does not just make threats, he actually follows through on them." "So do I," Diane said, sliding a folder across the table. "Gregory listened to me very carefully. The Securities and Exchange Commission is already looking into things. They have been reviewing Ashford Innovation's quarterly reports for months now because of some strange numbers. With your testimony or without it, they are going to find the offshore accounts sooner or later. And when they do, you are going to be involved as his partner in crime. You are the one who manages those accounts. You signed those wire transfers. Your name is all over those documents." All the color drained from Gregory's face. "You can choose to cooperate with us now," Diane went on. "We can negotiate for immunity. You can be on the right side of this whole mess before it collapses. Or you can wait, and you can go to prison right alongside Derek." Gregory just stared at the folder. His hands were shaking so badly that the coffee in his mug was making ripples. 3 days later, he met James in a deserted parking garage. He spent the entire time looking over his shoulder nervously. He handed James a small USB drive. $200 million in embezzled funds, Gregory said. "It has the offshore account numbers, the wire transfer records, and the emails where Derek specifically talks about hiding money from investors and the SEC. It is all on there. Everything." He stopped for a moment, his eyes red with exhaustion. "I have 2 daughters," he whispered. "I cannot even look at them anymore, knowing that I am helping a monster." His hands were still trembling as he turned and walked away. The clock now read 18 days. Catherine Mills filed a subpoena for Tori's complete medical history from Dr. Hoffman. It was a normal legal step, a court order that required the doctor to hand over the files. At the very same time, Derek's lawyers delivered a cease and desist letter to Dr. Hoffman. They threatened to completely ruin her career if she followed the subpoena. Dr. Hoffman talked to her own lawyer. The advice was simple. A court subpoena was legally binding, while a private letter was just a threat. She was legally required to comply. But following the law would have a heavy price. Derek's lawyers would file official complaints with the medical board. They would force her into endless hearings. They would cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal bills. They would do everything they could to take away her medical license. Dr. Hoffman sat alone in her office that night. She looked at the file on her desk. It contained 3 years of documented injuries. It had photos she had taken with Tori's permission. It had clinical notes describing bruises that did not match Tori's stories. She remembered the many times Tori had flinched when she simply touched her arm. She remembered how Tori's heart rate would speed up during exams, not because of medical anxiety, but because of the constant state of high alert that comes from living with violence. She picked up her pen. She signed the release form. Her hand shook just a little bit, but she signed her name. The very next day, Tori's entire medical file was sent to the court. It was the real one. It had every single photo, every note, and every injury documented over 3 years, and it included the records of the cervical bruising from the strangulation that would almost kill her during childbirth. The clock now showed 15 days remaining. Marcus Webb spent an entire week searching for Jennifer Torres. He finally found her in a small town 2 states away. She was living under a new name and working as a second-grade teacher. She owned a little house with a garden and a golden retriever. She had managed to build a quiet, normal life for herself out of the chaos that Derek Ashford had created. The first time Marcus knocked on her door, she only opened it a couple of inches, keeping the security chain locked. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement," she said. "I cannot talk about it. It was for $500,000. "That is what your silence cost you," Marcus said. "Meanwhile, he is still out there hurting other women. He strangled his pregnant wife on camera." "I know, I saw the video." Jennifer's voice was flat and tired. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 5 years trying to forget. "Then help me stop him." "I will lose all the money," she said. "He will sue me. He will send people to find me. You have no idea what he is like." Marcus left. He drove 2 hours back to the city. He stayed awake the entire night, thinking about Jennifer's face seen through the crack in the door. He remembered the fear in her eyes and the way she held herself, with her shoulders hunched and her arms crossed, trying to make herself smaller. He drove back to her house a week later. This time he brought printed photographs from the Gala. They were glossy, 8x10 prints showing Tori's pregnant belly. Jennifer's eyes were locked on the photograph, seeing Derek's hands on another woman's throat and a face twisted in absolute fear. She opened her door wider, her own hands starting to tremble uncontrollably. "She's pregnant," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely a sound. "Looks about 8 months." A moment passed before she added, "He did the very same thing to me. The choking. I honestly thought I was going to die that night." She slowly sat down on her own front steps. "When I tried to fight him off, he broke my wrist. He snapped it like a dry twig. Then he drove me to the hospital and told them I fell off a horse. Seriously, who falls off a horse in the middle of Manhattan?" Her golden retriever came over and pressed its body against her for support. "I'm going to break the non-disclosure agreement," she declared with a newfound strength. "I do not care about the money. I want you to use my real name. I am done being afraid of him." The clock on the wall showed 12 days left. This was all based on lies that Derek had fed to doctors he paid off. At the exact same time, Derek was holding a press conference. He was announcing a massive donation to a children's cancer charity. The cameras showed him standing at a podium with tears welling in his eyes. He looked humble, generous, and completely misunderstood. "In light of my recent personal difficulties," he began, "I want to get back to what is truly important, helping children in need. My wife and I have had our share of struggles, but I want to move forward with grace and compassion." He said, "My wife," as if they were still a happy couple, as if he had not just tried to end her life. The public story began to change immediately. Social media was filled with comments like, "Maybe she is the unstable one," and "He seems so genuine." Catherine, her lawyer, called an emergency meeting. "He is not just fighting for custody," she said. "He is rewriting reality, and it is working. We have to file our petition this evening. And Marcus, that newspaper article has to be published now before he completely controls the story." But all Tori could feel was the despair that kept her up at night. To win this, she would have to get on a witness stand. She would have to sit in a courtroom and describe every single detail of 3 years of abuse, all while Derek sat just 10 feet away from her. The man who strangled her would be watching her tell the world how he strangled her. The thought made Tori run to the bathroom and vomit. Her friend Becca held her hair back. "I cannot do this," Tori cried out, her face pressed against the cool tile of the bathroom floor. "Yes, you can," Becca said softly. "You have already survived much worse than a courtroom." Later that night, long after everyone else had gone to sleep, Tori did something nobody saw coming. She picked up her phone. She opened the recording app she had installed days before in the hospital, and she called Derek. Her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the phone. She dialed his number, pressed the phone to her ear, and waited. Derek answered on the second ring. His voice changed the second he heard her. It was his charming investor voice, the voice that fooled everyone. "Victoria," he said smoothly, "I am so glad you called. I have been worried sick about you. I have been thinking about what you said, about coming home. That is all I want for our family to be together. You, me, and our little girl. The way it was always supposed to be," he added. Tori kept her own voice perfectly steady. Every word she spoke was planned. She had practiced this conversation in her mind 100 times. She knew precisely which buttons to push. She understood Derek better than anyone, and she knew his greatest weakness was that he could not resist a chance to brag. "But I need to know one thing first," she said. "If I come back, what is going to happen to the people who are helping me? My dad? My lawyer?" Derek's friendly mask slipped away. It was only for a moment, but a moment was all she needed. "Your father is going to wish he never got involved. I will bury him," he snarled. "Catherine Mills will never practice law again. I have a team looking into her finances right now for anything we can use." "And that reporter, Marcus Webb? I've already got people digging into his background. Every single person who crossed me is going to pay." "What about Gregory?" she asked. "He quit." "Gregory is a dead man walking," Derek spat. "He thinks he can hide. I know where his daughters go to school. Lincoln Elementary, 3rd grade and 5th grade. I know their names. I know what time they get picked up." Tori's hands were shaking so violently now. She thought she might actually drop the phone, but her voice remained even and perfectly controlled. It was the performance of her life. "Okay, I understand," she said. "I just needed to know." "So you will come home?" he asked, sounding satisfied. "I will think about it," she replied. Then she hung up. She saved the recording. She just sat in the dark for 5 minutes, focusing on her breathing. Then she forwarded the file to Catherine with one simple message. "He threatened Gregory's children by name. He threatened Dad. He threatened you. He threatened Marcus. It is all on this recording." Catherine called her back in less than 60 seconds. "Where on earth did you get this?" she asked. "I called him. I recorded it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Tori," Catherine said slowly, "this is witness intimidation. He threatened minors. This is criminal behavior documented in his own voice. This is going to be played in a courtroom, and he will not be able to explain it away." "Good," Tori said. She had done this herself. No one had told her to. No one had planned it. She had used the one thing Derek never expected as a weapon, her willingness to listen to his threats one last time, her willingness to walk back into the fire and come out carrying the very evidence that would burn him to the ground. The countdown showed 10 days remaining. At 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, Marcus Webb's article went live on the website of one of the largest newspapers in the country. The headline read, "The Real Derek Ashford, a Pattern of Violence, Abuse, and Financial Crime." It was the result of a 6-month investigation, all packed into 12,000 devastating words. 4 of his ex-girlfriends were on the record, and they all described the exact same pattern. First, the incredible charm that pulled you in. Then, the isolation that cut you off from the world. Next, the complete control that ruled every hour of every day. And finally, the violence that grew until you did not even recognize your own life. Jennifer Torres was quoted throughout the article. She described the night Derek broke her wrist in graphic detail. She talked about the sound it made, the way he stood over her while she screamed in pain, and the drive to the hospital where he held her hand gently and told the doctors that she had fallen off a horse. The $500,000 check he wrote the next morning, still wearing his pajamas, was as casual as if he were paying a parking ticket. His lawyers handed her the non-disclosure agreement before the painkillers even had a chance to work. "I signed it because I was terrified," Jennifer was quoted as saying. "I signed it because he told me he would destroy my life if I did not. And then I spent 5 years pretending none of it ever happened." But it did happen. And I know it happened to others after me. That is what I cannot live with. 3 former employees also described violence in the workplace. A laptop was thrown at an intern's head during a presentation that did not meet Derek's standards. A female assistant was verbally abused so relentlessly that she quit without any notice and later filed for disability because of post-traumatic stress. They talked about his explosive rages behind closed doors that left furniture broken and the staff hiding in fear. The financial evidence from Gregory was all there in black and white. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, and wire transfers for over $200 million. There were emails where Derek openly discussed hiding money from investors and deceiving the government. The company's quarterly reports had all been faked to hide the theft. The article even included pictures from the security footage at the gala, showing Derek's hands around Tori's throat, with her pregnant belly clearly visible. Her face was a mask of pure terror in the moments right before the waiters pulled him off of her. Gregory was also quoted. "I worked for Derek Ashford for 10 years, he said. I watched him become a monster. I watched him hurt people and then pay them off. I watched him steal from his own company, and I did nothing because I was afraid, but I am not afraid anymore." The truth needs to be told. Within just 1 hour, the article had been shared 10,000 times. Within 2 hours, Ashford Innovations released a statement denying everything and threatening to sue. Within 3 hours, 2 more women came forward with their own stories of abuse. By midnight, Ashford Innovations stock had dropped by 15%. Derek left a voicemail on Tori's phone. She did not answer. She let it record. "That article is full of lies," he screamed. "I will sue that reporter into poverty. I will take our daughter, and you will never see her again." Tori saved the voicemail. It was just more evidence. Every word he spoke was digging his grave a little deeper, and he was too arrogant to even realize it. The custody hearing began 8 days before Tori's due date. It was day 1 in Judge Brennan's courtroom, and Catherine presented the evidence. First came the medical records from Dr. Hoffman, showing 3 years of documented injuries. There were clinical photographs that showed bruises on her arms, ribs, and wrists. The doctor's notes described a patient who would flinch at any unexpected touch. There was also documentation of the bruising on her neck from the strangulation at the gala. Next were the witness statements from 17 people who had been at the gala. All of them described the assault in vivid detail. Several mentioned that Derek had been drinking heavily all evening. 2 of them said they had heard him making threatening comments about Tori earlier in the night. Then the security footage played on the courtroom's large screen. There was no sound, just the silent, undeniable images of Derek following Tori, his hands closing around her throat, her body going limp, the waiters pulling him off, and Tori collapsing to the floor. Gregory Whitman's financial testimony came next, with bank statements, wire transfers, and email chains that proved $200 million could not be accounted for. Finally, Jennifer Torres was on the witness stand. Her voice was steady despite her trembling hands as she told the court about the broken wrist, the non-disclosure agreement, the payoff, and the 5 years she spent in silence and shame. The trial began with 3 of Derek's former employees describing his violent temper and terrifying outbursts at work. Then Catherine hit play on a recording from Tori. Suddenly, Derek's own voice filled the courtroom. He was heard threatening Tori's father, her lawyer, and Marcus Webb. He even threatened Gregory's children by name. An absolute silence fell over the room. Even Derek's own lawyers stopped taking notes. On the second day, it was Derek's turn. His defense team called 3 psychiatrists to the stand, none of whom had ever met Tori. Judge Brennan dismissed them all within minutes. She stated firmly, "Unless you have personally evaluated Mrs. Ashford, I am not interested in your speculation about her mental health." Next, Margaret Ashford took the stand. She was dressed in a simple black dress with pearls, looking like the perfect, dignified mother. She painted a picture of Tori as a difficult, controlling, and manipulative person. That is when Catherine played Margaret's own video from the night of the gala. It was the footage Margaret had recorded on her phone while her son was strangling his pregnant wife. The camera shook slightly as it captured the awful scene in the hallway. Derek's hands, Tori's body, and Margaret just filming it all. "You recorded your son attempting to murder his wife," Catherine said, her voice steady, "and you did nothing. You did not call for help. You did not try to stop him. You did not put down your phone," Catherine continued. "You just kept filming." Margaret whispered, "I was in shock." Catherine replied. Or perhaps you were gathering footage to use against Victoria later? At that, Margaret's calm composure completely fell apart. She had no answer. On day 3, Judge Brennan reviewed all the evidence. Then she delivered her decision. The evidence presented by Mrs. Ashford's legal team is overwhelming and deeply disturbing, she began. Multiple witnesses testified to a consistent pattern of violent, controlling, and abusive behavior by Derek Ashford that has gone on for more than 10 years. Medical evidence confirms years of physical abuse, and video evidence shows a clear and undeniable attempt to strangle Mrs. Ashford while she was 8 months pregnant. Judge Brennan then looked straight at Derek. Mr. Ashford, I find your defense to be an insult to this court's intelligence. You tried to murder your wife in front of hundreds of witnesses. You then used your wealth and influence to launch a smear campaign against the victim. You falsified medical records, you paid people to lie for you, and you stood in my courtroom today and continued to lie. Then, she turned to Tori. Mrs. Ashford, I am granting your petition in full, the judge declared. You will have sole legal and physical custody of your daughter upon her birth. Mr. Ashford will be allowed supervised visitation only for 1 hour per month in a secure facility with a court-appointed supervisor present. This arrangement will be reviewed after 1 year. Furthermore, I am issuing an emergency protective order. Derek Ashford is not to come within 500 feet of Victoria Ashford at any time. He is not to contact her directly or indirectly. Any violation of this order will result in his immediate arrest. I am also referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. What you did to your wife was attempted murder. You should be in jail, not standing in my courtroom making demands. The gavel came down with a loud crack. Tori completely collapsed into Catherine's arms, sobbing with a relief that shook her entire body. James wrapped both of them in a hug so tight it almost hurt. Becca was crying. Even Catherine, who had seen 100 courtroom victories, had tears in her eyes. Tori had won. It was over. Her daughter Charlotte was finally safe. The calendar showed just 3 days until her due date. They had made it just in time. 2 days after the custody hearing, at 3:17 in the morning, Tori woke up to a contraction so strong it stole her breath. She lay in bed for 10 minutes, timing them on her phone. They were 5 minutes apart, then 4, then 3. This was not a false alarm. This was real. She called her father, who answered on the very first ring. He had barely slept since the gala. Dad, she said, I think it is time. He replied instantly, I'm coming right now. Do not move. 10 minutes later, James was at her door with the pre-packed hospital bag they had prepared weeks ago. Everything was ready. Everything was planned. Except nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. At the hospital, Dr. Hoffman was waiting for them. She had been on call specifically for Tori's delivery. You are at 7 centimeters already, Dr. Hoffman said after a quick check. This baby is coming fast. They moved Tori into a private delivery room and James stayed by her side, holding her hand through every single contraction. Becca arrived 20 minutes later, a little out of breath. Sorry, I drove as fast as I could. How is she doing? Good, James said. The epidural is helping. The labor moved along quickly, almost too quickly. When Tori reached 9 centimeters, Dr. Hoffman's expression suddenly changed. She called for more nurses. She lowered her voice when she spoke to the anesthesiologist, but Tori heard the words that sent a chill down her spine. The cervical bruising from the strangulation is causing complications. She is hemorrhaging. Everything happened very fast after that. The room filled with people. The monitors started beeping with a different, faster, more urgent sound. Dr. Hoffman made a decision in 30 seconds. We need an emergency C-section now. Tori felt the room spin. She felt hands lifting her onto a gurney and the cold air of the operating room. She felt the epidural being adjusted. She reached out blindly until she found her father's hand. Is the baby okay, Dad? Is the baby okay? He squeezed her hand. The baby is fine. You are going to be fine. I am right here. Charlotte was born at 4:22 in the morning. She was tiny, pink, and screaming with lungs that were strong and healthy, completely unaware of the chaos she had been born into. But Tori was not fine. The bleeding was severe, and she had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Dr. Hoffman and her team worked frantically. They called for blood transfusions. More machines were wheeled in, more monitors, more people in scrubs moving with a controlled urgency. Tori's vision started to blur. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was her father holding Charlotte. His face was a painful mix of pure joy and absolute terror, with tears streaming down his cheeks. He held a newborn baby in his arms while his own daughter was bleeding on the operating table. She woke up in the intensive care unit 48 hours later. The room was dim, and machines beeped steadily around her. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else. Every tiny movement was filled with pain. The first thing she saw was a bassinet right next to her bed. Charlotte was sleeping inside it. She was tiny and perfect and just close enough to touch. Tori reached out a hand that trembled. She touched Charlotte's fingers through the bassinet rails. They were the smallest fingers she had ever seen, and they were warm, real, and alive. But she could not lift her daughter. She was too weak, too broken. The drainage tubes, the intravenous lines, and the monitors made it impossible. For the first 48 hours of Charlotte's life, Tori could only touch her through the bars of a hospital bassinet. Tori could not hold her, could not nurse her, and could not do any of the things she had dreamed of doing. This was the real price of Derek's violence. It was not about money, or reputation, or status. It was about the stolen first moments of a mother holding her child. And then, the second disaster struck. Catherine Mills appeared at Tori's bedside on the morning of the third day. Her face was serious. "Tori, I need to tell you something," she said. "What happened?" Catherine took a deep breath. "Derek's lawyers filed an emergency motion with a different judge, not Brennan. They are arguing that your medical crisis proves you are physically unfit to care for a newborn. They are requesting temporary custody be transferred to Margaret Ashford." Tori just stared at her lawyer. She was lying in an intensive care bed with drainage tubes in her abdomen. She had lost enough blood to nearly die. She had not even held her daughter yet. "We have 24 hours to respond," Catherine said. And then the third catastrophe hit that very same day. Gregory Whitman was found beaten unconscious in a parking garage. His laptop, which had backup copies of all the financial evidence, was gone. An anonymous tip to the police suggested it was just a random mugging, but everyone knew the truth. Derek might be under a protective order, and he might be facing criminal charges, and he might be losing his fortune. But he still had people willing to commit violence for him. People who would beat a man unconscious in a parking garage and steal his laptop on command. Tori lay in her hospital bed. She could not walk. She could not hold her daughter. Her friend Gregory was in a coma just down the hall. A different judge was reviewing a motion to take Charlotte away from her. Her father was pacing in the hallway, looking older and more defeated than she had ever seen him. Becca brought Charlotte to her bedside and placed the bassinet where Tori could reach. Tori slipped her fingers through the bars and touched Charlotte's tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around hers on instinct. They were warm, impossibly small, and impossibly strong. "I won the hearing," Tori whispered to the sleeping baby. "I had the evidence. I had the judge's ruling. And none of it mattered. He is still coming for us." "He will never stop," Tori whispered. "Then we do not stop either," Catherine said firmly. She set her briefcase on the bedside table and pulled out a laptop and a stack of legal documents. "Can you sign papers?" Tori looked at her weak, trembling hand. "I can barely hold a pen." "Then we will figure it out." Catherine's voice was steady and fierce. "We have 24 hours. We are going to use every single minute." Catherine filed the emergency response right from Tori's hospital room. She typed on her laptop while Tori dictated between waves of pain. Their main argument was devastatingly simple. Mr. Ashford strangled his wife so severely that it caused cervical bruising, which led to her delivery complications. He is now using those very complications, which he himself caused, to argue that she is an unfit mother. This court should not reward an abuser for the damage he inflicted. The new judge wanted to hear from both sides. He scheduled an emergency hearing for the next morning. Catherine requested that Tori be allowed to appear by video from the intensive care unit, and the judge agreed. That night, James came into Tori's room and closed the door. "I have information," he said quietly. "Through Diane's contacts. This new judge has financial ties to Derek's family. Model. To one of Derek's investors. A personal investment in one of their funds. We could expose the conflict of interest, get him removed from the case. Tori looked at her father. Then she looked at Charlotte, sleeping soundly in her little bassinet. No, she said. Dad, that is what Derek does. He uses his connections to manipulate the entire system. If we do the same thing, we are not any better than he is. This is not about being better, Tori. This is about winning. It is about both, she replied. One day Charlotte is going to grow up, she will ask questions, she will want to know how I handled this fight, and I need to be able to look her right in the eye and tell her that I did it the right way, that I did not become the very thing I was fighting against. James looked at his daughter for a long time. This woman, lying in a hospital bed, who could barely even sit up. This woman who had nearly died bringing her child into the world. This woman who was fighting for custody from the intensive care unit while the man who put her there was trying to take her baby away. Your mother would be so proud of you, he said softly. The hearing began at 9 o'clock the next morning in the courtroom. Derek's lawyers presented their case. They argued that Tori was physically unfit and that Charlotte needed stable care. They proposed that Margaret Ashford would be a suitable temporary guardian. Derek's own chair was empty. His lawyers explained to the court that their client was unable to attend because of scheduling conflicts. The man who was filing for custody of his newborn daughter could not even be bothered to show up. Then, the video connection was established. Tori's image appeared on the courtroom monitor. Her face was pale, and she was wearing a hospital gown. An intravenous line was visible in her arm, and drainage tubes could be seen under the blankets. Behind her were the beeping monitors of the intensive care unit, and right beside her, just at the edge of the screen, was the bassinet where Charlotte was sleeping. The judge saw a woman who had almost died in childbirth because of injuries given to her by the very man asking for custody. He saw a mother fighting for her daughter from a hospital bed while her husband sent his lawyers and stayed home. Tori asked for permission to speak directly, and the judge allowed it. Your Honor, she began. 3 days ago, I nearly died while giving birth to my daughter. The complications were the direct result of injuries my husband gave me when he strangled me at 8 months pregnant. She paused, taking a steadying breath. The courtroom was completely silent. I am speaking to you right now from a bed in the intensive care unit. Model. I have not been able to hold my daughter yet. I have not slept in 3 days. But I am here. I will always be here because that is what mothers do. My husband is not here today. He sent his lawyers. He always sends someone else to do the things he will not do himself. That is the difference between us. I show up. Even when it hurts, even when I am terrified, even when my body is broken and machines are beeping and I cannot stand on my own 2 feet, I show up because my daughter needs me to show up, and I will never, ever stop showing up for her. The courtroom was silent for what felt like a very long time. The judge looked at Derek's empty chair, then looked at Tori on the screen, at her broken body and her unbroken will. Motion denied. Full custody remains with Victoria Ashford. 3 days later, Gregory Whitman opened his eyes in a hospital room 2 floors below Tori's. The first thing he said to the police officer at his bedside was this. Cloud backup. Everything is on the cloud. The password is my daughter's birthdays. The stolen laptop had not mattered. Gregory had backed up every single document to an encrypted cloud storage account long before he handed the drive to James. Every email, every record of a wire transfer, every offshore account number, every single piece of evidence that proved Derek had stolen $210 million from his own company. Derek's men had taken the hardware, but they had completely missed the data. The Securities and Exchange Commission now had everything it needed. What happened next was the complete and total destruction of everything Derek Ashford had ever built, and at the same time the rebuilding of everything he had tried to destroy. In the first 2 weeks after Charlotte was born, Tori left the hospital. She spent her first night back in her father's house with Charlotte in her arms. She held her daughter for hours. She did not sleep. She did not even want to sleep. She just wanted to feel the weight of her baby on her chest, the warmth, the soft breathing. the tiny heartbeat. Federal agents raided the headquarters of Ashford Innovations. They took computers and all the financial records. They interviewed the employees. They began to build a case that would take months to put together in court, but only seconds to understand. Derek Ashford was a thief. During the first 2 months, Derek's offshore accounts were completely frozen. The banks were forced to hand over his statements. The evidence against him was staggering. He had stolen $210 million over a 5-year period. He faked the company's quarterly reports and lied to shareholders and government regulators. During this time, Tori reapplied for her old job at the nonprofit organization she ran before she married Derek. They hired her back on the very same day. She started part-time because she was caring for a newborn baby. She was also still healing from surgery and rebuilding her entire life from scratch. In the third and fourth months, the company's board of directors called for an emergency meeting. The first vote to remove Derek as CEO was 7-5. It was not enough. To push him out, they needed a special majority. Derek immediately went to work on the 5 board members who supported him. He promised them the investigation was just a temporary problem. He swore the company's stock would bounce back. He insisted he was innocent. But a woman named Diane Sullivan also began talking to those same 5 board members. She met with each of them one by one. She clearly laid out the personal legal trouble they would be in if they continued to support a CEO who was under a federal investigation. She explained in very careful detail how their own personal money could be taken away. She described how their names would be dragged through the mud in the newspapers. She warned them that their own business partners would run for the hills. The second vote was 10-2. Derek Summersand was fired as the chief executive officer of the company. It was a billion-dollar empire that his own father had started. Security guards walked him out of the building. The employees stood by and watched in complete silence. They saw the man who used to throw laptops at young interns and scream at his assistants walk past their desks for the very last time. Tori was promoted to a director position at the nonprofit. Her first paycheck was not very large, but she used it to buy a crib for her daughter, Charlotte. It was a real crib, in her very own apartment, and she had paid for it with her own money. Over the next 2 months, the government seized everything Derek owned. They took the penthouse apartment in Manhattan and the mansion in the Hamptons. They took his vacation home in Aspen, his yacht, and his entire collection of luxury cars. They even took his $30 million art collection. It was all sold off to pay back the money he had stolen. His creditors came for him. His old business partners sued him for breaking their contracts, and former employees filed lawsuits against him for creating a toxic work environment. The legal bills were so high, they ate up any money the government had not already taken. His lawyers eventually quit, citing unpaid bills and claiming they could no longer work with him. Derek was then assigned a public defender to handle his criminal trial. Tori signed a lease for a 1-bedroom apartment. It was small and simple. The kitchen was so tiny that only one person could fit inside. The bedroom closet was just a small fraction of the enormous walk-in closet she once shared with Derek, and the view from her window was not a sparkling city skyline, but a plain brick wall. But every single piece of furniture in that apartment was something she had picked out herself. The blue sofa, the yellow chairs for the kitchen, and the bookshelf filled with picture books for Charlotte. The framed photograph of her mother on the dresser. Everything in that apartment was hers, and only hers. And that is when a woman named Amber Collins came forward. She called Tori first and told her everything. Just as Tori had suspected, Derek had started secretly monitoring Amber's phone. He began to criticize her friends, her job, and the way she looked. He started using that terrifying phrase, "Look what you made me do." Amber had financial records that showed every single dollar Derek had spent on her using company money. He had used his company to lease her apartment. He bought her expensive gifts with the corporate credit card. He even paid for their trips with wire transfers from the business. The federal investigators added even more charges against him. There was more theft and more fraud. The case against Derek became stronger, bigger, and more impossible to escape with each passing day. Tori spoke at a support group for victims of domestic violence for the first time. There were 15 women sitting in a circle in the basement of a church. She told them her story. She did not tell them all of it, but she shared the parts that truly mattered. I was one of the lucky ones, she said. My father had money and most people do not. He spent every penny he had to fight my abuser. Not everyone has that chance. So what do we do? One of the women asked. You save yourself, Tori replied. I know that sounds impossible. I know how tired and scared you are. But you just have to take one small step. You call a hotline, you tell one person the truth, you save $1 in a secret bank account, you just take one single step toward the door. She looked around the circle and saw her own reflection in every face. The door was never locked, she said softly. I was my own jailer. I stayed because I was afraid. But being afraid and free is so much better than being afraid and trapped. Then she received a phone call she never expected. It was from Margaret Ashford, Derek's mother. It was late in the evening and Charlotte was already asleep. Tori almost did not pick up the phone. Victoria, please do not hang up. What do you want? Tori asked. The anonymous phone call, Margaret said. The one that told you about Derek's second bank account? That was me. There was a long silence on the line. Tori slowly sat down. I could not stop him in public, Margaret said, her voice starting to break. I was too scared, but I knew I could point you in the right direction. Why did you not do more? Tori asked. Because I spent 30 years married to a man who was just like him. Derek's father hit me for 3 decades. I thought it was normal. I just accepted it. I taught my son that violence was how men showed love, without ever having to say those words. I taught him that. And by the time I understood what I had created, it was too late. Margaret was crying now. I raised a monster. I can see that now. I am getting help. I am in therapy and support groups. I am trying to understand how I let myself become this person. That does not excuse what you did, Tori said, thinking of Margaret calling her unstable on television. No, Margaret whispered. Nothing excuses it. Tori did not forgive her, but for the first time she understood her. Margaret was the person Tori could have become. If she had stayed for another 10 years, another 20, another 30, she would have become a woman trapped so deep in the cycle of violence that she could not even see it anymore. She could only pass it down to her child, like a terrible disease. The supervised visit took place on a Tuesday. It was in a gray government building with cameras in every corner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A social worker named Linda sat quietly by the door. Tori sat at a table, holding Charlotte in her lap. Her daughter was 4 months old now. She was a curious and alert baby, always reaching out for things. When Derek walked into the room, Tori could barely recognize him. He had lost a lot of weight. His hair was a mess. He was wearing a cheap suit that did not fit him right. His face looked thin and tired, with dark circles carved under his eyes. He looked 10 years older than he did at the company party. He had already been convicted of his crimes. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and the evidence against him was undeniable. Tori had testified. She sat in the witness chair and told her story in a clear and calm voice. She pointed to the fading scars on her neck. She looked right at the jury and told them the truth, the whole truth. She told them everything she had kept hidden for 3 long years, and the jury believed her. They found him guilty on all the charges. His sentencing was scheduled for the next week. Derek's eyes went straight to Charlotte. A look of sadness crossed his face. Maybe it was grief, or maybe regret, or maybe he was just realizing everything he had lost. She is beautiful, he said, his voice sounding rough. Can I hold her? No, Tori said. Victoria, please. She is my daughter. I just want to hold her for 1 minute. You tried to kill her, Tori said calmly. When you had your hands around my neck, you were killing both of us. You do not get to hold her. Derek's jaw tightened. Tori knew that look all too well. It was the anger building inside him, the moment he was about to lose control. But he could not do anything here. The cameras were recording everything. Linda, the social worker, was watching. Security was just outside the door. He had no power here. I'm sorry, Derek said. For everything. I was under so much pressure. From work, from my family. I was not myself. Stop. Tori's voice was firm. You do not get to do that. Do what? He asked. Make excuses, blame your problems, pretend you are someone you are not. You are yourself, Derek. The man who threw things at me, the man who twisted my wrist, the man who cut me off from my friends and my family, the man who tried to strangle me while I was pregnant with your daughter. That is who you really are. I was sick, he pleaded. I needed help. You are not sick, you are abusive, Tori said. There is a difference. Sick people want to get better. They take responsibility for their actions. They try to change. You did not do any of those things. Even right now, in this room, you are still making excuses. You destroyed my life, he muttered. No, Tori replied. You destroyed your own life. Every bad thing that is happening to you is because of the choices you made. My father spent $800 million to ruin me. My father spent $800 million to protect me, Tori corrected him. To protect Charlotte. Because that is what real love looks like. You do not know what love is, Derek. You think love is about control and possession and ownership. But it is not. Love is about sacrifice. It is about protection. It is about putting someone else's safety and happiness before your own. Tori adjusted Charlotte in her arms. Her daughter was reaching for a toy on the table. She was not the least bit interested in the man sitting across from her. By the time you get out of prison, Tori said, Charlotte will be a grown woman, and she will know exactly who you are and everything that you did. And she will make her own choice about whether to have a relationship with you. That is her decision, not mine, not yours. Derek stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Linda, a social worker, took a step forward as the security guards tensed up. I cannot do this, he snapped. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of the room, the door shut behind him with a sad, empty sound. Tori stepped out of the building and into the bright afternoon sun. Becca was there, leaning against the car. How do you feel? She asked. Tori took a moment to think. She thought she would feel a sense of victory or justice, or maybe just satisfaction. But she did not feel any of those things. Instead, she felt lighter. It was like a heavy weight she'd been carrying for years, a weight she was so used to she had forgotten it was even there, was finally gone. I feel nothing, she said, and that feels completely right. A week later, a text came from Catherine. 25 years. Attempted murder, embezzlement, witness intimidation. The sentences will be served one after the other. It is really over. Tori did not go to the courthouse to hear the sentence. She was at the park with her daughter Charlotte. She was 7 months old now, crawling happily on the grass and grabbing little handfuls of dandelions. She babbled at the birds flying overhead. Tori read the message, then put her phone back in her pocket. She gave the swing a gentle push, and Charlotte laughed. The sound was so pure and free, full of everything that truly mattered in the world. That evening, long after Charlotte was asleep, Tori sat on the couch of her small apartment. She opened the voice memo app on her phone and started to record something. It was for Charlotte, for her to listen to one day when she was old enough to ask about her father, when she was old enough to want to know the real story. Hi, my sweet girl. If you are hearing this, it means you are ready to know the truth about me, about your father, and about everything that happened. So this is what I need you to know. Your father was an abusive man. It was not because of stress from his job or pressure from his family or anything else on the outside. He was abusive because he chose to hurt the people he said he loved. That was his choice. It was not my fault, and it is not your fault. It was his. I stayed with him for 3 years. I made excuses for his behavior. I ignored every single warning sign. I honestly believed I could fix him. I thought my love would be enough. I learned that love is never enough when the other person does not want to change. I also learned that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. Your grandfather, Becca, Dr. Hoffman, Catherine, Marcus, Gregory, so many people helped me get away. I could not have done it by myself, and that is perfectly okay. The minute I stopped waiting for his permission to save myself was the minute I was finally free. You are not responsible for what your father did. His decisions have absolutely nothing to do with who you are or the person you will become. You get to decide your own future. I will never let anyone in this world make you feel small. I will teach you to stand tall, to use your voice, and to be completely and totally yourself. That is the lesson your grandmother taught me, and it is the lesson I am teaching you." She stopped the recording and saved the file. She knew she would add more to it over the years, to build a complete picture of the truth. There would be no sugarcoating and no bitterness. There would only be the facts, the reality, and all of her love. In a prison cell 500 miles away, Derek Ashford sat on a hard metal cot and stared at a gray concrete wall. The cell was 6 feet by 8 feet. The only light came from a fluorescent tube on the ceiling that buzzed all the time. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. He had no pictures and no letters. Nobody was coming to see him. The balance in his bank account was zero. His company was gone. His beautiful homes were gone. His cars, his yacht, his art collection, his expensive custom suits, his secret second phone, his private jet, his name in big letters on the side of a building. It was all gone. 25 years stretched out in front of him. 25 years of concrete walls, terrible cafeteria food, buzzing fluorescent lights, and complete silence. He closed his eyes, and the only image that ever came to his mind was from the supervised visitation center. He saw Charlotte sitting on Tori's lap. She was only 4 months old, reaching for a little toy. She never looked at him. She had no idea who he was. She did not care that the stranger sitting across the table was her father. By the time he was released, she would be 25 years old. She would know everything. She would have seen the news articles and read the court documents. She would have listened to her mother's voice memo. She would know exactly what kind of man her father was and everything he had done, and then she would make her own choice. In a one-bedroom apartment across the city, at that very same moment, Charlotte was pulling herself up, holding onto the coffee table. She had been trying to do this for days. A monster tried to destroy her family, but in her quiet living room, Tori watched a tiny miracle unfold. If you believe that love is stronger than evil, you need to see how this story ends. Her daughter, Charlotte, was fighting her own little battle. She would grab the edge of the coffee table, pull herself up, and stand there for a few shaky seconds before tumbling back down. But every time she fell, she got right back up. This was not a baby who cried. This was a baby who would just grin and try one more time. On the apartment walls, photos told a story of love. There was a picture of Tori's mother holding baby Charlotte, her face glowing with a fierce love. Another showed James holding his granddaughter in the hospital with tears of wonder on his face. In another, their friend Becca made silly faces as Charlotte giggled. Even Dr. Hoffman was there, smiling at Charlotte's very first checkup. But there were no photos of Derek, not a single one. Tori sat on the floor, her eyes fixed on her determined daughter. Her phone lit up on the table nearby. A text from her lawyer, Catherine, was on the screen. The message said the appeal was denied, the sentence was confirmed. 25 years. It was finally over. Tori placed the phone face down and turned back to her daughter. Charlotte grabbed the coffee table again, pulled herself up, and wobbled. This time she found her balance. She stood firm. She looked straight at her mother and flashed a big, open, fearless smile. Then she took her very first step. That single step was paid for with $800 million. James Caldwell spent every dollar he had, every single penny he had earned over 30 years of building a business from nothing. He used to dismantle the man who tried to kill his daughter. When people asked him if the cost was worth it, he always gave the same answer. He would say that the money was never his to begin with. It was always hers. Derek Ashford went to prison with nothing. He had no fortune, no company, no family, and no legacy. He only had 25 years of concrete walls ahead of him. He would live with the knowledge that his daughter would grow up in a home that belonged to someone else. As for Victoria Caldwell, she dropped the Ashford name the very day her divorce was final. She became the woman she used to be, the one who ran marathons, the one who had strong opinions, the one who dedicated her time to helping people, the one who was not afraid to take up space in the world. She promised herself she would never let anyone make her feel small again, and she would make sure her daughter never would either. This story was carefully researched, written, and edited by our team to share a powerful lesson about life. Each story we create is meant to entertain you, inspire you, and empower you. We truly believe that great stories can change lives, and we promise to always bring you content that matters. Thank you for being a wonderful part of our community.